No soldier fired a shot. No bomb was dropped. No army crossed a border. Yet an entire empire, the most powerful in human history, collapsed from the inside. The weapon used? A radio signal, a pamphlet, a whisper. This is the war nobody talks about, because the winners never admitted they fought it. It is 1947. The smoke of World War II has barely cleared. Europe is broken, divided, and exhausted. And quietly, without a single declaration of war, a new conflict begins. Not on a battlefield, inside a mind. The Soviet Union controls the lives of over 300 million people across Eastern Europe, but more than their lives, it controls their reality. Strict travel bans, censored mail, state-run newspapers, state-run radio, total information lockdown. If you lived behind the Iron Curtain, you did not know what the outside world looked like. You only knew what Stalin wanted you to know. This was not an accident. It was the strategy. Because Stalin understood something that most generals never do. The most dangerous weapon isn't a gun. It's a competing idea. If people never hear that freedom exists, they will never demand it. If they never learn their government is lying, they will keep believing the lie. Control the information, and you control the people. Forever. The West watched this and asked a question that had no easy answer. How do you fight a wall you can't shoot at? Enter a quiet American diplomat named George Kennan. In 1948, Kennan placed a proposal before the U.S. National Security Council. His argument was simple but radical. You cannot defeat the Soviet Union with tanks, but you can defeat it with truth. The NSC approved. The CIA created a new division, the Office of Policy Coordination, with a mandate that was deliberately vague, deliberately deniable. It would conduct covert operations including propaganda, economic warfare, and support for underground resistance movements. And crucially, all of it had to be planned so that the U.S. government could plausibly deny any responsibility. The plan had a classified code name, Project Umpire. The idea was elegant in its deception. Build a radio station, but don't make it sound American. Make it sound local. Make it sound like the radio station that Poland or Hungary or Czechoslovakia would have, if their press were free. In 1949, Radio Free Europe went on air. In 1951, Radio Liberty followed. This one aimed directly into the Soviet Union itself. These were not propaganda stations in the crude sense. They didn't shout American slogans. They broadcast news, real news, accurate news, that the people behind the Iron Curtain were being denied. They covered strikes the Soviet press ignored, trials the state hushed up, famines the government called successes. They reported the world as it actually was, and they tailored every broadcast to every country. Over 20 separate stations, programming in Polish for Poles, in Czech for Czechs, in Romanian for Romanians. Voices that sounded like neighbors, not foreigners. Lech Walesa, who would later lead Poland's solidarity movement and become president, listened to Radio Free Europe. Václav Havel, the dissident playwright who became the Czech Republic's first president, listened. Millions of ordinary factory workers, farmers, and students, they all listened in secret, with the volume turned low, with the curtains drawn, because listening was a crime. But the Soviets fought back. They jammed the signals. They deployed massive transmitters designed to drown out Western broadcasts in a wall of noise. Some nights the jamming worked. The voices disappeared into static. So the West sent balloons. The Free Europe Press, a covert branch of the same operation, began launching weather balloons from West Germany. Each balloon carried leaflets, thousands of them, printed with news, with facts, with the truth the Soviet press refused to print. By 1956, nearly 600,000 balloons had been launched. They carried over 300 million individual pieces of printed material across Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. For millions of people living under communist rule, these pieces of paper floating down from the sky were the only outside news they ever received. The Soviet governments issued over 400 formal protests. They called it illegal. They called it an act of war. Every protest they filed was, in effect, a confession, confirmation that the balloons were hitting their target. Radio Free Europe even taunted the jamming openly. It would broadcast to listeners in specific regions. Look skyward, more leaflets are coming. The invisible army had found its artillery, and it fired paper. This was not guesswork. This was science. Psychological warfare, at its core, is the systematic exploitation of human vulnerability. Not physical vulnerability, but emotional and cognitive vulnerability. Fear, loneliness, the desperate human need to belong, to understand, to know the truth of one's own situation. But the Cold War version was different from every psychological warfare campaign before it. It did not exploit fear. It exploited hope. The CIA's critical insight was this: a person who knows they are being lied to and who has access to a competing truth will, over time, stop believing the lie. You don't need to convert them in a day. You don't need them to rebel tomorrow. You just need the seed of doubt to take root. Because once a person starts questioning, they rarely stop. The results were tracked carefully. Every refugee who crossed the Iron Curtain was debriefed. What were people saying? What had they heard? What did they believe? The answers shaped the next broadcast. This was a feedback loop, a learning machine, running for 4 decades. And the Soviets, for all their power, could not stop it. Every time they jammed a signal, the West built stronger transmitters. Every time they arrested someone for listening, 10 more people got curious about what was worth arresting someone over. In 1956, Hungary rose up. Ordinary Hungarians, students, workers, soldiers, took to the streets. They tore down Soviet statues. They demanded freedom. They had listened to the radio. They had read the leaflets. They believed, genuinely believed, that the West would stand with them, that help was coming. It wasn't. Soviet tanks rolled in. The revolution was crushed within days. Thousands died. Hundreds of thousands fled. Radio Free Europe was blamed. Critics argued the broadcasts had given Hungarians false hope, had implied, without ever quite promising, that America would intervene. The operation faced its darkest moment. Was this a war of liberation, or a war that got people killed from a safe distance? The operation did not end, but it changed. It became more careful, more deliberate. It stopped implying rescue and started simply delivering truth. It played the longest game in modern history. 30 years passed. In Poland, the Solidarity Trade Union, led by a man who had grown up listening to Radio Free Europe, organized the largest workers' strike in communist history. The government negotiated, then cracked down, then negotiated again. The information war had created something the Soviets feared more than any army: an organized, informed civilian population that refused to be controlled. In 1975, the Helsinki Accords were signed. The Soviet Union, seeking economic legitimacy, agreed, in writing, to respect human rights. It was a trap they walked into willingly, because now dissidents had a legal document they could wave at their own governments. Radio Free Europe broadcast the entire text. Millions heard it, and they held their governments to it. By the late 1980s, Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev introduced glasnost, openness. It was too late. The people already knew everything. They had known for decades. On November 9, 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. Not because an army attacked it, because the people on the eastern side had spent 40 years learning, one broadcast at a time, one leaflet at a time, that the wall was a lie. And lies eventually cannot hold. 2 years later, in 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved. The CIA's covert book distribution program, which had been quietly flooding the Soviet bloc with banned literature for decades, was shut down. Its mission was complete. The empire that had controlled 300 million minds for 70 years did not fall to a missile. It fell to a radio signal, to a balloon, to a book, to the irresistible human hunger for truth. Here is where this story stops being history and starts being right now. The war without weapons never ended. It evolved. Today, the battlefield is your news feed. Governments, the US, Russia, China, run sophisticated information operations on social media at industrial scale. Fake accounts, coordinated narratives, algorithmically amplified division. The US and China wage what military analysts now call cognitive warfare in the South China Sea. Not with ships, but with staged images, disinformation, and narrative control. Russia's military doctrine explicitly describes information warfare as an activity to be conducted in both wartime and peacetime, with a goal of manipulating the opponent's population through disinformation, societal manipulation, propaganda, and blackmail. The tools changed. The strategy did not. And here is the terrifying difference between then and now. In the Cold War, the people behind the Iron Curtain knew they were being lied to. They could feel the walls of the cage. Today, the cage has no walls you can feel. The manipulation is invisible, personalized, delivered to you by an algorithm that knows your fears, your loyalties, and your blind spots better than you do. Sun Tzu wrote this 2,500 years ago. He said, "The standard of excellence is subduing the enemy without fighting." The Cold War proved he was right. The question for right now, today, for every one of us, is whether we are the ones with the radio, or the ones who never knew we were listening. The most powerful weapon ever built had no trigger, no barrel, and no blast radius. It had a frequency, and it changed the world.